Let me tell you, I'm a big believer in that. Yeah, I get over it really quick.
You took that. I could tell. Well, he's not
Still at home?
Yeah, he's saying he's going to try to make it to church.
Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and start. We're still cold today, but maybe we'll still have a few roll in on the ice, but we'll see how it will work out. We are in Philippians chapter 3 as we finish the third chapter today. I want to start off by doing this. I could find this in my drawer. I would need to have a bigger one, just the best I had. But let me do. That is 1 foot.
That's what?
Now, most babies are bigger than that when they get grown, when they get born, aren't they? Now, sometimes they're not. You're premature. We had a friend in Santa Fe that she delivered at 5.5 months, and you can put the baby in the palm of your hand. So it doesn't happen that way. But if you were to go on, that's about how big our daughters were when they were born. And this is as far as this goes, which is 3 feet. But that's a different measure too. Now we do that all the time to measure something called maturity. And we want to know, are you on the right scale? My grandchildren have been, 2 of them have been below the scale considerably for a lot of their life, but then they grew up. My granddaughter was, for height, when she was 3 years old, was in the, at the 17th percentile. What that means is 83 more people ever out of 100 at her age that are taller than that. Today she's at the 98th percentile. She grew, and she's one of the tallest ones in her class. And that she always likes to remind people of that. But we're going to talk a little bit about maturity. But when did you become mature? Now that's a loaded question. I'm assuming you are. So when did you become mature? Nora?
Foxhole in Vietnam.
Okay. That matures you quickly, doesn't it? Changes a lot of things. When did you mature?
Still working on
You're still working, okay. Not there yet.
I thought it was when I got driver's license.
Okay, were you?
Looking back, no.
That's true. I mean, it's interesting. Now, the next question is, how did that happen? How did you become mature?
Well, sometimes we become more mature when we feel like we don't need someone's assistance.
Okay.
As our parents, as a son or daughter, my mom or dad, I'm being more self-sufficient. I'm
Okay.
paying my own bills. I'm paying my own car payment.
Okay, so how when you get self-sufficient, Lauren?
On a more serious side is the fact, I believe it's when you finally realize in your pea-sized brain that the world doesn't revolve around you.
Okay.
And that you need to become part of the world.
Part of the world. As one person said, the whole world except for one trifling is composed of others. And that's true as well. So, and then the third question is, what traits demonstrate maturity? If you were to look at somebody else and said they're mature, what would they be like?
Responsible.
Responsible, okay.
Reliable.
Reliable, that's a good one.
Disciplined.
This is, you hate to make the comparison, but this is kind of like what the Supreme Court said about pornography. I don't know what it is. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And that's kind of what we do with maturity. In today's lesson, Paul's going to start measuring things. And we tend to measure maturity in a physical sense. We'll talk about more of that in a moment. But we tend to also say, comparing to someone else, kids do this a lot. They start standing back to back and saying, who's bigger? Now, in my family, there's something else that's happening. Since my wife is 5 foot tall, I have 3 granddaughters, 2 of whom are constantly looking and saying, am I as big as you now? And they stand her up and they get next to her and they start measuring and see how far they have to go. One of them asked my wife, said, when did you stop growing? And she said in 4th grade. And then she asked this question, are you ever going to grow again? The answer is no. The problem is that we compare ourselves to other people. When Paul wants to do this, he compares himself to Christ himself. He uses this word that we met last week, not that I've already obtained all this or am already perfect. Now the word perfect appears in today's lesson is the word mature. Perfect can mean reach your full height, get to the end of your growth cycle. And so you would become mature when that would happen on a physical level. He's talking about a spiritual level. And so he comes along in today's lesson, he said, let those of us who are mature, same word, think this way. He's going to talk about what these people need to do to take the next step up in their spiritual lives. It's a good question for us all to ask, because we tend to think this is normal and that this is going to take place on its own, and it's not. And so how do we pursue Christian maturity is what we're going to talk about today. And so let's unpack it. First word I'm going to look at is spiritual. How would you describe spiritual? What is a spiritual person like?
Godlike qualities.
Godlike qualities, okay.
You try to live up to the standard of the fruit of the Spirit.
Okay.
You consider that in your daily life.
Okay, living up to the standard of fruit of the Spirit, okay.
When Jesus told us, be holy for I am holy.
Okay.
So being holy means spiritual.
Okay. No, that's being holy because God is an important one. It's interesting because a lot of people say, well, I just feel it. Really? What does it feel like? Have you ever asked somebody who says they are quite spiritual because they feel spiritual, what do they feel like? They don't know. Because feelings are indescribable. You know, you have the same, I told one guy one time, he was a teenager here, he would give devotional talks from time to time. He was in LTC speech, and he said, I don't know about you, but I'm scared to death when I get in front of people. I said, let me tell you something. Think about it this way. The same feeling of fright is the same as excitement. It feels exactly the same way. So the next time you feel that, talk about how excited you are. He said, I hadn't thought about that. Same feeling. And so here's this idea that somehow it feels a certain way because I look at a sunset and it makes me feel a certain way, or I hold a baby and it makes me feel a certain way. But feelings are kind of misleading. As the old Scottish preacher said, well, some people believe it's better felt than telt. I just feel it. I can't tell you what it is, but I just feel it. Well, feel what? We don't know. And this is why Paul wants to externalize this today in this lesson. He talks about that it's about thinking. Now, spiritual and thinking don't seem to go together for a lot of people in our society. You're spiritual because you don't have to think about it, and the thinker is not very spiritual. And therein lies part of the problem. But he uses the word think. We've met the word before. We met it in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5. Have this mind, this thinking among yourselves, which was in Christ Jesus. He said that's the same idea. So let me give you this definition. This is mine. And I think a person is spiritual when he sees the world from heaven's point of view. He begins to sift the world through the eternal perspective of God. And I say it that way because it will affect your behavior when you do it. It will affect your attitudes when you do it. It will affect a lot of things. But then we're going to talk a little bit about growth. That's the spiritual part. This is the growth part. There's something called physical maturity. We all know what physical maturity is. It's when you put your kid up against the door facing, you measure him once a year with a ruler on top of his head, and you make a mark and put a date on it. The next year you put him at the same place, you make a mark and you put a date on it. And you watch that mark get taller and taller. That is the historical record of a family's life, by the way, that usually gets painted over or redecorated away. But the growth remains. And so we all grow spiritually, or physically at least. But then there's emotional and mental maturity. Oh, by the way, physical maturity doesn't always come when we think it does. We had a friend, Vicky's best friend in high school, was about her same size, same height. And she went off to college. I don't know where she went to college. She's much smarter than us, but she got a doctorate in art, and I couldn't get a doctorate in finger painting if you wanted me to. But so she came back for our 20th high school reunion. Now, there's a lot of difference between 18 and 38. Okay? But there are some things you expect to have about the same. One is everybody kind of is this level at the same place. Or as tall as you were in high school is probably as tall as you were when you're 40. This girl went off to college, and she grew 6 inches in college. All of a sudden she got there and she's here. And the first words out of our mouth is, how did that happen? She said, I don't know. It just happened. So it doesn't always happen on schedule. But emotional and mental maturity is something as well. And that is always lagging behind the physical. When most people don't understand that just because someone is grown doesn't mean they're mature. I can illustrate that by 2 ways. When I was on the Gulf Coast, I baptized a man who I married, and his wife was large, and he was. When I baptized him, he was like 350 pounds, 6 foot 9 inches tall. You could put his wedding ring around 2 of my fingers. Okay? Now, I got him in the baptistry. I'll never forget, I told him, I said, I whispered in his ear, I said, I've never lost anybody baptizing, but you may be the first. So you're going to help me. And we became good friends, but one of the things happened, he and his wife had a child. And because the child had the genetics of the family, when the child was 2 years old, he looked like he was 4. So everybody started treating him like he was 4, that he's supposed to act a certain way. He was a 2-year-old. He had the physical characteristics without the mental and emotional ones that went with that age. So you couldn't measure him from his height and say that's who he was. The second is, why is it especially that young men have problems as teenagers and early young adults? There's a part of your brain, right here, called the prefrontal cortex. It is what, for lack of a better phrase, it is the gatekeeper of your life. It tells you when to not do things. It gives you permission and tells you, don't be stupid, stop doing that. You realize that men, especially, this part doesn't develop until at least 25. Does that help explain why an 18-year-old who gets upset can shoot up a school? He doesn't have a gatekeeper. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do yet. Why is it that that young men race in the middle of the night and wrap their cars around telephone poles? Because they don't have the emotional maturity yet. But the last one we're going to look at is spiritual maturity. And it's not anything like the first two because it starts a lot later. It starts at baptism. And Paul says that there is this process that has to go through that to maintain or to attain a certain amount of maturity. He talks about the measure of the full stature of Christ in Ephesians chapter 4, mature manhood, and he's not talking about how tall you are. He's talking about how you relate to Christ and the church. Peter would say there are newborns who need pure spiritual milk, but they need to start growing up. There is this expectation that just as the human body grows physically and the mind grows emotionally and mentally, the spirit needs to grow the same way. Problem is, that's not something that happens naturally. A kid is going to grow. He's going to develop. That doesn't mean spiritually we will. It's a different process, and that's what Paul tries to address it in the lesson today. So let me ask you this, can a person be physically mature and emotionally mature, but not spiritually mature? Have you seen those?
Yeah.
How do you know that, John?
Well, I think, like when Christ instructed us to seek first the kingdom of heaven, not so much, what your position is going to be in this world. And then so right there, just take your whole level of thinking about it. And a lot of people that are of this earth, where their treasure is, and so their heart is. We want to have our heart is on spiritual things.
Yeah.
Kingdom instead of, and so there's a lot of people that are seeking only power,
Okay.
position, income.
Okay. There's the idea of the hypocrite, for instance. The hypocrite knows more than he's willing to do. That's spiritually immature. When you know what to do and you don't do it, James says that's called sin. Why? That's immaturity. It's the same thing that would happen is if you're 18 years old and your mother said, don't forget to take out the trash. And you don't take out the trash. You're going to get in trouble. The difference is this is eternal trouble and not just a tongue lashing at some point. So what does Paul outline to get us to this point? This is what the lesson's about. He talks about we all need to reach to a certain level of maturity. He starts to give some ideas about that. First of all, what's not said. Paul doesn't give a list in this passage or anywhere else from what I can tell of a certain number of activities that if you do these things, it will produce growth. We like to reduce things to lists. Reading X number of chapters in the Bible per day. Praying X number of minutes per day. Going to worship services 3 times a week. Attending Bible classes. We want to reduce them to behaviors. Now, the behaviors flow out of something else. He says, I want to talk about the heart that creates the behavior, not just going through the pieces of it. You can go through the pieces of it and never be any bit different. But he's talking about the heart that's here. So he says, first of all, you need to know where you are. It's always an interesting concept, knowing where you are. Where are you? I love it when they go to malls and they have that map that says you are here. The problem, that hasn't helped me a bit because I don't know where I am. That just says you are here. Big deal. Like, yeah, I'm here. I want to go over there. It doesn't say you are here, here's how to get over there. It's the beauty of having a GPS. Is it tells you at least where you're supposed to go, whether it takes you the right way or not. He says you got to know where you are. He says, there are those of you, he says, you need to think this way if you want to be mature. Let those of us, notice what he does. He changes from himself. Because up to now in chapter 3, he's talked about himself, what his goals are, and what he's trying to proceed with, and what he's pressing on to. Here he says, now all of us, pulls us all together, and it says, if you want maturity, you need to think this way. So you have to kind of jump backward to find out what the this way is. He says, in last week's lesson, chapter 3 and verse 12, I haven't obtained this or have been made mature. He said, I'm not there yet. One thing Paul says is, don't get on your high horse thinking you're better than you are, because you're not better than you are. A lot of people are legends in their own mind, but they're not any better. And they think, I don't have to do much more, I'm there. No, that's not where you are. And he talks about that also hold true to what you have attained. It'd be kind of like they've attained something. Paul says they've already climbed the mountain. It would be really bad, though, to get close to the top and slip and slide backwards. He uses a term to hold true. It means to march in rank. It's a military word. And so he says, make sure you stay in your ranks as you do this. Know where you are, know what you've done, know where you're going, but know that you haven't gotten there yet. It's not where we need to be, but we keep pressing on. That's a sign of spiritual maturity. Know you're not there yet. That you're trying to get there, you're dealing with life, you're handling it, but you're not where God wants you to be yet. Very good measure of that. John?
Well, we have some good examples of people that thought they were there, like the scribes, Pharisees,
Yeah.
and such, and it's like, you said, the hypocrites, and thinking that they achieved a certain thing, and they're exclusive, and that's the last thing Christ wanted.
Yeah. One I like is Peter. Peter thinks he's got it all together. And so when Jesus starts talking about his death, he says, basically, over my dead body, this is going to happen. And that's when Jesus said, get behind me, Satan, you're a hindrance to me. And he thought he was stronger than he was. Right up until he said all those dirty words. And then he realized he wasn't as good as he thought he was. Peter had a lot of problems. He always thought he was better than he was, and he had to keep getting knocked down. And so, we're not there yet. And as long as you can consider the fact we've got a long way to go in our spiritual maturity, you're on the road to spiritual maturity. Kind of a paradox, if you will. The other is look for examples. Paul will say that you need to have an example. How important is it to have examples in your life? Who are examples? What makes a good one? You think about that?
I don't tell you that's that.
Okay. How do you know how to study? You ever think that way?
We should use Christ as an example.
Okay. Use Christ as example, exactly.
Well, I think examples provide a pathway for us. In other words, in terms of how we can make decisions, or how we
Okay.
and diminish fears about
Okay.
making decisions.
Okay. We need them to help us to make decisions in a way. It's one of those ideas that nobody learns how to do anything without seeing it done first. You learn to write that way. You know, put a pencil in your hand and you've got this perfect whatever. Your handwriting, in my day and time, it was cursive, but today we don't know how to write. We've gone back to being a Neanderthal with crayons between our toes. But you don't learn to write that way. They put the example on the wall. And you say, follow the lines. When you learn how to walk, you didn't know how you learned how to walk. You learned how to walk because you watched somebody walk. You learned how to talk because somebody helped you talk. Our daughter was, she was almost 2 before she said anything. Oh, I wish she would have stayed that way. But we go to the ear, nose, and throat doctor because we thought she had constant ear infections like a lot of kids have, and she would say things like she wants something, she'd grunt. You give it to her. The doctor said stop giving her that. So every time she grunts, she's not going to talk, so you're going to force her to talk. She'll listen to you and then realize that's what's going to happen. And so he would always take gloves and he'd blow them up into balloons. And so what does she do to the doctor? She points over there and goes, and he gives her a balloon. And we had to learn to quit giving her whatever she wants, so she'd have to learn to talk to us because that's the way she was being interacted with. That's what examples show us things like that. Nobody knows what to do. I always like the old story about the preacher who he would get into the baptistry. Now, this is an affectation, by the way, and there are people, and I've known this all my life, people get in the baptistry, and the preacher raises his hand. Do you know why the preacher has raised his hand? Which part of the Bible did it say, before you baptize someone, raise your hand? And if they don't raise their hand, you go to one of the elders and say, he didn't raise his hand. It didn't take. You know why did you raise your hand? Because you watched somebody else raise their hand. That's the only reason. No other way to put it. You watched an example and decided that was the right way. You might have missed the lesson, but you got that part. But Paul says you got to have an example. He said, brothers, join in imitating me, and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us. He said, you need to watch what I do. This is a favorite topic of Paul, by the way. He's going to bring it up in the 4th chapter again. But he says to the Corinthians, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. I'm imitating Christ. If you'll imitate what I do, you'll be imitating him distributively. So watch what I do. I'm flesh and blood. He tells the Thessalonians, you became imitators of us and of the Lord. They watched Paul for 3 weeks and figured out this is what Christianity must look like. I don't have a lot of teaching, but I can remember what Paul did with this. And that's how they survived. And he tells them in the 2nd letter, you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We weren't idle. He said, we were working. And so whatever we did, you need to do the same thing. We gave you the instruction through our lives. That's what Paul says. Go find an example. Go find somebody that if you want to know what to do, pay attention to them. Because he also says, keep your eyes on them. Look at them and don't quit looking. Find somebody that is an example for you, somebody who's one step beyond you, and say, what are they doing? What are they like? How are they thinking? You have to get to know them a little bit, but you find those people and they help you in spiritual maturity. And the question we always need to have in our minds is, do you have your own life that somebody else can follow? If this is the principle of spiritual maturity, the next generation down has to have it in the next other generation up. The day you break that chain is the day the church falls apart. When you have lost the examples, you have lost the thread back to the 1st century. Are you aware that you and I are the products of watching people who have watched people, who have watched people, who have watched people, who go back all 2,000 years? If nobody's watching anymore, where are we going next? It's a critical issue that Paul brings up. Third is remember where you belong. Paul likes this word. He uses some words that are particular to an audience. The Philippians were one of those. He uses a single word twice that he never uses anywhere else in the New Testament. And so he says, what do I need to tell you specifically so you'll understand? And he says that I have told you many times, even with tears. Now it's interesting what he's talking about here. Paul says there are some things that make me weep. The man of joy has his moments. These are the things that make me weep. That there are enemies of the cross. And so he's going to start talking about the things that are where you really belong to be in life. He talks about the enemies of the cross. Now we're not sure who the enemies are, frankly. I suspect that it's on two different sides. It's just the way I am, at least, maybe. Because you read what Paul has to deal with in the rest of the letters and in Acts, he's dealing with two different philosophies of life. And I like the passage in Matthew chapter 7 where it says, enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy, it leads to destruction. Which is the narrow way. You know what happens when it's narrow? You can fall in the ditch on either side. And one day at lunch, I had a car at that time that was a standard transmission. And I pulled it in my garage. Didn't put the garage door down. That day and time we didn't do that. And my daughter comes in Remember, she learned how to talk, and she did a lot of it. And she says, in her own nonchalant, might be kidding, might not be voice, your car's rolling. Do I take her seriously or not? It's my question in my mind. I thought, on the sake of safety, yeah. So I go out, and I had forgotten to put the parking brake on. I left it neutral. Here's my car. Rolling down the parking. Across the road, we did not have storm sewers, we had ditches. And the ditch was about, this deep. And so I ran as fast as I could, hopped in that car and got it stopped before it got to the ditch. But things that you don't stop get in the ditch. Paul's dealing with ditch problems for these people a lot of times. There's one side of the ditch that says we're going to be legalists. We're going to make Christianity about rules to be kept. He tells the Galatians, he said, the problem with you Galatians is when I taught you the gospel of Christ and the grace of Christ, he said, you decided, you deserted, and that you want to distort the gospel into something else. You want to distort it into rule following. And he says, I'm going to tell you something. You're not justified by all those things of keeping all the pieces just precisely like the Jews would do it. That's not going to get you to heaven just because you have good performance. He says you're not justified. You're not made right just simply because you are a good guy. So he said there are those people who do that. Now, Paul has already addressed this issue earlier in chapter 3. He's talked about circumcision. He says, you think you're good, let me tell you what good is. And we'll play the game, as we described last week, of who can top this. And he started talking about all the things he could do, and all these people who insisted on circumcision. Paul would say, their glory, what they boast about, is really their shame. Because they have forsaken Christ for themselves. The other, though, is that there was another group that made Christianity permissive. When Paul writes to the Romans, he has to deal with an issue that has been arising in the church since the beginning of speaking about justification by faith through grace. That because people take grace to be a get out of jail free card. And that's happening in our world today. Well, God takes care of it. Don't worry, God take care of that. I feel forgiven. I killed that person, but I feel forgiven. Really, how did that come out? And so the Romans said, are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Maybe if we sin a whole lot more, God will be even better. So the worst of sinners can be forgiven the most. Isn't that great? And so Paul says, understand what that is. That makes your God your belly. This region of the body in the ancient world believed that that was the seat of emotion. It was how you felt things, partly because when you get upset, the first place you feel it is here. When you get bad news, the first place you feel it is here. You don't feel it here. You don't even feel it here, you feel it here. And the concept of the butterflies in the stomach, there it is, right there. He says their God is their belly. He says what that means is that they're using their feelings, their emotional senses to say, whatever I like is what I want. If I want 4 pieces of chocolate pie, I can have that. Because my belly tells I can do that. If I'm hungry, I can eat whatever I want to. If I have a sexual appetite, I can do whatever I want to with that either. If I want to steal, what's keeping me from doing that? He says they have made their feelings, their emotions, what they want, the God of their life, and they have now, it's all set on earthly things, except their thinking is life. He says their end, both sides, their end is destruction. Now, he goes on to say, but our citizenship is in heaven. The word citizenship is used twice in the book of Philippians. It means politics, if you will. That's how we get our word politics. Politica is the word. And it describes being a citizen of a place. The Philippians were citizens of a free city. They ran their own lives. They had their own law courts. They were left alone by the Romans to do what they needed to do as long as they showed themselves to be citizens of the kingdom. It was a high privilege that not all had. So he talks about in Philippians 1 and verse 27, the manner of life. Act like a citizen. Now it's interesting what he's talking about. It's something I started thinking about. This is my passport. And when I travel overseas, I have to show that they're in country. It says that the country of origin, nationality, is United States of America. On the cover, it shows which nation you're from. But if you turn a page or two into here, you can't see this well, but there are stamps on the inside of the passport. Stamps so show that you entered the place and you left the place to go back home. Paul says while you're here, you got a stamp on your passport, an entry stamp. He said, one day you're going to go back home and you'll get an exit stamp. But remember who gave you your life. Our citizenship is in heaven. We want to go home. That's a problem that a lot of people struggle with. They want to be citizens of the earth. Leonard Buford, who was the blind choral director at ACU for years, said he didn't like to sing the song, "This World Is Not My Home." He said, because I haven't met too many people who are homesick yet. And Paul says we're awaiting the coming of the Savior, the glorious change of our body. And we're just wanting to go home. You know what's the best part of the trip when you go overseas? Is when you feel those wheels drop out of the belly of the plane as you're coming back into the United States. Best part of the trip. Because you're going home. So Paul says, remember something. Where you are is not where you're supposed to be. You're headed, you're a citizen of heaven. And so we only have passport stamps here. So what does it take to pursue spiritual maturity? Well, first of all, you have to know that you haven't arrived, but you're still striving. So look at yourself carefully. The second thing, though, is to look at, for examples. You need to look around to others for models. If you'll do that, you can find somebody who can show you a better way than you're doing it now. And the other is to look to heaven, because that's where you're going inevitably anyhow. That's where we all want to go one day. It's interesting what Paul says. He said we're all becoming something in some way or another. I like this story. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a story called The Great Stone Face. Now, the story doesn't apply anymore because that outcropping has fallen off the side of the cliff. But before 1974, this is what that looked like. It's at White Mountain, New Hampshire. The story is about a boy named Ernest. Ernest, when he was growing up, had heard the legend that there would be a great wise man who would come one day. And they would know who he was because he would look like the face on the mountain. So Ernest would go through town and he would always look at the face on the mountain. Ernest began to grow. One day, as he got to about middle age, he realized that people were pointing at him. And they were whispering behind his back. He was hearing things like, that's him. He's here. It's happened. So he stopped in front of a plate glass window and he looked at his own image and he realized that he had become the man on the mountain. That's what we're trying to do, is become the man on the mountain. But we're not there yet. We still have ways to go. We still need people to help us there. But God says, I want to take you there. Next week, Paul's going to start wrapping up the book of Philippians. And so I hope you'll join us for that.